Hey, everybody. With everything going on with Israel and Israel's enemies, with the Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas, there is a very disturbing development happening on Israel's southern border with Egypt. Have a look.
אז קודם כל באמת נתחיל עם עניין המנהרות החוצות. הרבה זמן באמת היו אמירות שיצאו מצה"ל, שאמרו שאין מנהרות כאלה, וגם אם היו, אז הם הושמדו. לפחות מהבדיקה שעשינו ממש בשעות האחרונות, יש למעלה מ10 מנהרות שחצו משטח אזור פילדלפי, רפיח, לעומק שטח מצרים. אנחנו מדברים על מנהרות שחלקן בעומק של 30 ו-50 מטרים, מנהרות משמעותיות, ובנוסף חלקן גם בעומק השטח, זאת אומרת במרחק של למעלה מקילומטרים לתוך השטח. אבל מה שמעניין יותר שקורה זה במרכז סיני. וכפי שאני מבין, בישראל מזהים הפרה בוטה של הסכם השלום איתם, שנחתם לאחר מלחמת יום הכיפורים, ובין היתר בנייה של מכשולי שריון לטנקים אפשריים, היערכות לוגיסטית משמעותית במרכז חצי האי סיני, וכל הדברים הללו, כאמור, כמו שאמרנו, בניגוד להסכם, נוסיף לזה גם התבססות צבאית, יותר כוחות, גם משוריינים, גם דיוויזיות בתוך סיני, שבהתחלה לכאורה הם היו למלחמה בדאעש, וכעת בישראל מזהים את הדבר הזה, רואים אותו בחומרה, ולהבנתי גם מקיימים שיח מול המצרים בעניין, יהיה בהחלט שווה לעקוב אחרי הדבר הזה בתקופה הקרובה.
All right, just to sum up what we just heard, Israel signed a peace deal with the Egyptians in the late 1970s. That was during the Carter administration, famous Camp David deal. Part of that peace treaty was that the Sinai Peninsula, which is the area in between mainland Egypt and Israel, would be, for the most part, demilitarized. The Egyptians, over the decades, have been violating this peace treaty in a variety of ways. But recently, in recent years, the buildup of their military assets in the Sinai have increased. Now, there was a time during the war against ISIS and Al-Qaeda that those terrorist groups had set up shop in the Sinai, and Israel kind of acquiesced to the Egyptians having a lot of military assets there because the Egyptians were fighting against those terrorist groups. But that's not the story right now. To help us make sense of all of this, we're going to bring in my good friend, Major Elliot Chodov. What is going on with Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula?
What's going on is a continuation, and I think to really understand it, we do have to go back to the treaty of 1979 and understand that the key element from the Israeli perspective to the treaty was what I call the built-in guarantee. It was the security appendix, but it was really the important part. And that was, as you said, it essentially demilitarized Sinai. To be more specific, it divided Sinai into 3 strips, A, B, and C, where A was the one nearest the Suez Canal, in which the Egyptians were permitted about 25,000 troops, in other words, essentially a reinforced division. And in B and C, meaning the center and the Israeli side closest to Israel, they were permitted only border police, light troops, and that sort of thing. And let's just so that we understand, a division is not enough to really threaten Israel. It could be an irritant, but it's not a real threat. The reason I call it a built-in guarantee is because what it did essentially is that it separated the Israeli military from the Egyptian military by about 135 miles and the Suez Canal. Okay, in other words, even if they decided to violate it on the grand scale, which they haven't since 1979, I'm talking about an actual attempt to attack Israel a la Yom Kippur 1973, it would take them about 10 days to get from where they are to the Israeli border. And the key in understanding this, and this is why the report is so important, is logistics. In other words, moving forces is relatively easy, but moving logistics is a whole different story. It's ammunition, it's fuel, it's spare parts, it's all of that kind of stuff. And to supply an army over 135 miles just doesn't work. So that was the guarantee. And by the way, it held, the key to it was tested when Mohammed Morsi came into power after the fall of Mubarak and the so-called Arab Spring, which of course we all now call the Islamic Winter. But Morsi was Muslim Brotherhood. He was no friend of Israel. There was a great fear that he would violate the agreement, but he really physically couldn't. In other words, he couldn't just turn around. In other words,
it worked.
Okay.
The demilitarized zone did its job.
Exactly. It did its job above and beyond. And that was really the key. Why Israeli gave up the air bases and the early listening and its logistics forward into Sinai and so on. After the Arab Spring began, and with Morsi and then into Assisi, as you mentioned, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, all sorts of characters, jihadi organizations set themselves up in Sinai. No friends of the Egyptian regime, certainly enemies of Israel. And they requested, that is, the Egyptians requested permission to move forces into Sinai to combat them, and Israel agreed. In my opinion, a very, very questionable agreement. But I say questionable. It's not one of these things where you can categorically say it was the wrong thing to do. It was problematic. It was a trade of a strategic asset of a treaty against an immediate threat. But of course, you never know how those threats are going to develop. It's a problematic situation. By the way, during that same period, we did not permit their Air Force to fly airstrikes into Sinai, but we did it for them. In other words, the Israeli Air Force, coordinating with the Egyptian army, struck the jihadi organizations. We launched airstrikes into Sinai at their invitation and with their coordination. And all in all, in the end, basically defeated them. That's the good news. The bad news is, A, they haven't pulled their forces out, which, by the way, anybody surprised by that shouldn't be. And this isn't about malice. This is about, once you've got your forces there, they're there. You've created a new status quo. The real danger that's happening now, and it comes out in part in that report, first of all, the Egyptians supposedly were destroying the tunnels between Sinai and Rafiah under the Philadelphia route. Apparently they haven't. Here again, I'm not surprised, but apparently there are people who are. The IDF stated unequivocally that there weren't any more, and they were wrong. And with all due respect to an organization that an army that I'm still an officer in, they're not perfect. The intel people aren't perfect. They missed it. And it shows a much greater cooperation on the part of Egypt with Hamas over the past number of years, because these tunnels were not tunnels that were dug overnight. Now, I don't know, and it doesn't say in the report, and I haven't seen in reports, how high that cooperation goes, because here's something else that we need to keep in mind. No system is a perfect pyramid top-down leadership. Egypt, much less so than, say, Western countries. There could very well be a group within the military that's actually doing this without necessarily receiving instructions from the top. Possible, okay? I wouldn't rule it out, let's put it that way. Because here again, Assisi is not Brotherhood. He's anti-Brotherhood, even though he's a devout Muslim. And Brotherhood and Hamas, of course, are synonymous. It's possible that it's coming from the top. It's possible that it could be a deal. We'll help supply Hamas if the Brotherhood leaves us alone, in Cairo and Egypt Central. So there are all sorts of possibilities. I wouldn't jump to any conclusion there. Let's put it that way. No, the really disturbing thing that's going on is that they are building air bases, which are completely against the agreement. The only airfields they're permitted to build in Sinai are civilian. They've built at least 2 air bases capable of receiving the F-16s that have been provided to them by the United States. Command centers for much more than a single division. As it is now, they have about 3 divisions in Sinai, but much more than that. In other words, an army-level command center at Hashiba, which is where we had our early listening posts way back when, before 1979, and additional logistical bases. And if you ask me, the element that concerns me the greatest is the logistics. In other words, their ability to move their logistics across the canal and into Sinai, that jumps them forward, if I set a 10-day timetable, by at least 50%. In other words, it cuts it down to about a 5-day And that's tight for Israel.
Bottom line, I think the elephant in the room over this whole issue is, if you look at Egypt, they don't have any enemies that threaten them on their immediate borders. And the question is,
Correct.
if they're building up all these military assets in the Sinai Peninsula in the direction of Israel, who are they imagining themselves going to war with?
Okay. So first of all, obviously in Sinai, they imagine themselves going to war with Israel. In and of itself, I don't necessarily see that as a threat. I see it as concerning. But countries build up forces on their borders. There are all sorts of issues of insecurity. It's a little more complex than that. My concern is not the present. My concern is the future. In other words, if the situation of Sinai today were the same when Morsi came to power, the peace treaty might have collapsed. He might have said, okay, we've got 3 divisions, let's make it 6, let's threaten the Zionists. And from there, a very, very quick deterioration to armed conflict can happen very quickly. That's really the concern. In other words, not for today, tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow. And we saw the Mubarak regime fall relatively quickly. We saw the Assad regime disintegrate in a week and a half. What happens when a hostile regime comes into power, however it does, in Egypt, and they decide, okay, we want to end the treaty, and they have the force to do it in Sinai, and they think they can get away with it. And here, let me just add the final point to this. It's not a question of whether they win or lose. We don't want a war with Egypt. It's going to be a bloody mess if there is one, and we'll win it. The key here is to prevent them from making the mistake of thinking they can win.
There you have it. The Egyptians are building up military assets in the Sinai Desert while Israel is preoccupied with so many other threats on its borders. Please remember to share this video, like it, tell other people about this channel, and drop a comment below if you have any thoughts on what we talked about here. Till next time.